We're in lesson 9 of the series of lessons that we've been studying as we've been walking through the Old Testament history and just reevaluating, if you were, re-examining, I should say, some of that history in summary form and examining some of the crucial events, if you will, that have happened throughout the history of man from the beginning of creation, and we've made our way through the original covenant made to Abraham. We've been through his immediate children, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We found ourselves with Joseph, who ended up a prominent figure in Egypt, though in an unorthodox way that he got there, but yet became a prominent figure. His family's able to come into Egypt. Pharaoh's favorable to Joseph because of their relationship, gives the Israelites a place to reside in the land of Goshen. They lived there for about 400 years and ultimately or eventually become slaves to the Egyptian pharaohs. And Moses is sent back to allow them to be led out of that bondage. When they come out of that bondage, they run into some obstacles. Moses helps them through some of that. He ends up on Mount Sinai to receive the law. He's gone a little longer than they thought he could be, and so when he comes back down 40 days later, he has found that they've already gone back into idolatry and have begun to worship a golden calf. Frustrated with that, he breaks the tablets, and God's pretty frustrated with the people as well. And Moses and God have a conversation that basically ends up sparing the people. God sends Moses back up on the mountain to receive that law again and bring it back down to them, because they're still going to be this special, peculiar people, and to bring about the heritage of God, and ultimately that Jesus would arrive because of that heritage. And so in lesson 9, we're going to talk about, and there's two crucial, if you will, I guess we could call them structures or elements that God's going to use. What are they? What are those two things that He's given Moses instructions to build? The tabernacle and then the Ark of the Covenant, right? So you're going to have, we'll get to all of that before we get done this evening. But there's this imagery of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and other things that Moses has given very specific and detailed instructions of how to construct, how to put it together, what its purposes will be, and then they will have to abide by that from that point forward. We talked briefly Sunday morning that the tabernacle would be what kind of structure? Permanent or temporary? Temporary, right? Because it's going to have to serve an interesting function. And what is that? It's going to have to move. It's going to have to travel. It's going to have to be able to be taken down and relocated and put back up so that God can still have a place for a center of worship, and yet it's going to move as they wander eventually through the wilderness. It will move with them. And I think the important aspect that we need to remember is that phrase there towards the end of that paragraph talking about the tabernacle is that God gives Moses very specific instructions, and he's to build it according to what? According to the pattern. That God has given a specific pattern by which the tabernacle should be constructed. And if you're going to honor God, then you need to honor what? Yeah, the pattern that He gives. We need to honor the details and instructions that He gives to them. They might have said to themselves, well, we'd like maybe something a little nicer than this tent-like looking structure. Maybe we'd want something more vast or more elaborate. And yet that wasn't what God instructed them to do. It's very simple in some ways, and we could show you a quick live action artist rendering, maybe we might call it here. But you can see that in this basic depiction of the tabernacle, it's very what? It's very simple. It's very simple. And again, number one, because it's going to have to be movable, but the emphasis was not on how wonderful or grand the tabernacle and the basic courtyard around it would be. It's the fact that what was going to happen there. You're going to communicate with God directly. You're going to worship God there. You're going to have your direct connection to Jehovah is going to happen as it relates to this tabernacle. It didn't have as much to do, and in some ways the honoring of the pattern had more to do with their respect for God and an example of that than it was about constructing just this perfect tabernacle structure in the sense of some ornate or some grand place. Very, very simple place that they would have, and yet significant because God would communicate with them there. And and they would begin to build a better and stronger relationship, hopefully, with their Creator by doing just that. Let's go over real quick to Exodus chapter 39. And I want you to look with me for a few moments here. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these details. Let's pick up in about verse 32. Exodus chapter 39, verse 32. So he says, "Thus was all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of the congregation finished. And the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so did they." Great phrase, right? They did all that the Lord had commanded them. Rightly so, after what had just happened. You know, all that scene after Mount Sinai, and that's, you know, the circumstances surrounding their behavior and God's almost destruction of the people. That's pretty wise of them to build the tabernacle exactly as God had sent those commands through Moses. And so they bring the tabernacle unto Moses, the tent, and all his furniture, his tacks, his boards, his bars, his pillars, and his sockets, and the covering of ram skins dyed red, and the covering of badger skins, and the veil of the covering, the ark of the testimony, and the staves thereof, and the mercy seat. We'll talk more about that when we get to it here in a few moments. The table and all the vessels thereof, and the showbread, the pure candlestick with the lamps thereof, even with the lamps to be set in order, and all the vessels thereof, and the oil for light. Remember, they had been given, we talked about that Sunday, they had been given instructions about how different people were supposed to, at different moments, bring the oil that could keep these lamps going. And the golden altar and the anointing oil and the sweet incense and the hanging for the tabernacle door, the brazen altar and his grate of brass, his staves and all his vessels, the laver and his foot, the hangings of the court, his pillars and his sockets, and the hanging for the court gate, his cords and his pins, and all the vessels of the service of the tabernacle for the tent of the congregation, the clothes of service to do service in the holy place, and the holy garments for Aaron the priest, and his sons' garments to minister in the priest's office, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So the children of Israel made all the work, and Moses did look upon all the work, and behold, they had done it as the Lord had commanded. Even so had they done it. And Moses did what? Bless them. So you go from that moment where he comes down off the mountain, and he's disgusted with them, right? He is completely disgusted and frustrated, so much so that he breaks those tablets of stone and has to be hewn a couple more and go back up on the mountain to get the law again. But on this occasion, you can imagine, I don't want to, excitement might not be the right word, but you can imagine the joy he must have felt that after he gives, and though this is not even remotely as ornate and specific and as detailed in some senses as what will be eventually the temple, right? When Solomon builds that, the first one in particular. But yet, what did we see in those several verses we just read? Lots of what? Well, detail, right? Lots of detail. Lots of detail. And so God didn't leave to chance or their own mindset what it is they were going to construct. He gave them tons of detail. And Moses looks at it and he appreciates, and it brings a sense of joy to him that he gave instructions that came from God. They did it exactly as they had been instructed. And because of that, the narrative says he blessed them. Because you see a turning point, at least temporarily, in the relationship between Moses and the people. As they've turned away from that selfish mindset and actually have chosen to preserve and honor the instructions of God and built this tabernacle as God had commanded them to do. And that really, and sometimes we can get caught up in the detail work, and that would be fine in some senses to notice. But the end result is what we need to appreciate, that it was built exactly as God had said. They honored what He wanted.
And it teaches us, too, that God is concerned with small things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God has an interest in the details as much as He does the big picture. And sometimes we can get a sense maybe in our minds that God is only interested in the big picture things. But I think we see a detailed God. We see a God who's interested in the big picture of the ultimate arrival of Jesus through this heritage. But yet He's also interested in seeing whether man is willing to honor the very detailed and patterned approach towards worship and honoring Him. And that, by the way, that disposition hasn't changed. God still desires the Hebrew writer, right? He speaks to that. I believe if you looked over in Hebrews chapter 8 and in verse 5, notice that when the Hebrew writer makes a comment concerning the importance of patterns, if you will, he references back to this idea, who serve under the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. And so this example of how to do things according to the pattern is even acknowledged here by the Hebrew writer in chapter 8 and verse 5. Thoughts or comments about any of that? I'm not sure what you're... Yeah. I'd have to look. Nothing jumps out at me as it relates to that either. Yeah, but yeah. So I'd have to reevaluate, take a look and see, but not off the top of my head. Go ahead, Zane. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and you go back to that image that we showed. You're right, because you've got a place, and you can see it in that depiction there, a place to make sacrifice, a place for purification, and then a means by which to gain access to God. And that pattern, um, though not we don't have a physical tabernacle anymore, but that pattern is still in place in the sense that we become the living sacrifice. We purify ourselves through the blood of Jesus, and that then gives us access to the Father through the great high priest that Jesus is, not through the order of Melchizedek, or rather not after the order of Aaron, but after the order of Melchizedek. You've got that similar pattern. These are the shadows, and then we've got the realistic thing that God intended when Jesus arrives. But you see that parallel of sacrifice, purification, access to God. And though their implements and elements are different, that pattern still exists, even for us.
Purification is baptism.
And that's the way we cleanse ourselves through the blood of the Lamb. Yep. Thoughts or questions again? Go ahead, Mary.
I think it just amazes me that these people, the way they had to sacrifice and carry this around and set it up, and sometimes we have trouble getting up and walking in this building.
Yeah.
I just wonder how many Christians we would have today if we still had to do as these people did.
Yeah, it is an interesting. I mean, obviously they've got more of them than we would have of us in some senses, but it is an interesting little thought that how many of us would show up in 6 inches of snow to set up our worship place so that we could worship. It's a fair question to challenge ourselves to think about, where we've got the comforts and all the ease sometimes, and yet we still struggle. And can you only imagine if we'd had to put some labor and work just to have a place to come in contact with God? Would that challenge us even more? Good thought. Okay, so that's your basic structure of the tabernacle and the things, and we read through those things that were in it. You kind of see how that might be laid out here in this example that you're seeing on the screen. Stephen called the tabernacle a tabernacle of what? In Acts chapter 7. Okay, say it one more time. Witness, right? And so it's a testimony. Where was Moses when he received the instructions for building the tabernacle? Okay, right. He returns back up there. And there's instructions that come prior to chapter 31. Is prior to him coming down. Chapter 31, he gets some of the instruction, comes down off the mountain in 32 and finds the people, and then has to go back and get the law again. But you see that happening as it relates to Moses. The intent of God all along was to have this tabernacle constructed. We talked a little bit about that Sunday morning. You wonder a little bit, does God know what's out on, well, He does know, right? He knows what's out on the horizon. But He establishes a temporary, movable place of worship before they fall. Before Moses comes down off the mountain and finds them in chapter 32, God's already established a way for them to have a mobile place of worship. Even before He condemns them to the 40 years of wandering. Who was this Bezaleel, and why was he important? Okay, he was a master craftsman. We talked again a little bit about him, not in detail, but what the purpose he would have, and that God blessed them for this particular purpose, being able to craft these specific items that God desired to be there. Yeah, yeah. He wasn't just assigned because he was a master craftsman. He has that obligation, but that ability from the language of the text seems to be coming directly from God as it relates to that. All right, so you've got the tabernacle, but you also have within it the what? Okay, you got the Ark of the Covenant. And I was trying to find some depictions of this. There's tons of artist renderings that may or may not be completely accurate in some ways, but you can kind of get a little bit of a sense of what it might look like. Remember, it's made of what? Wood, okay, and then it's covered with gold. And so it's made out of wood, covered with gold. The narrative teaches us. We'll see that in just a minute, I think, when we look at it. I tried to find you maybe kind of a realistic, and I grabbed this picture and didn't realize it was from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So never mind that. I was trying to find something realistic. I pulled it and filed it, and then when I pulled it back up and looked, I thought, wait a minute, that's Indiana Jones. And so, but that's kind of it, though, right? That's kind of it. But just the movie's kind of fake. All right. Anyway, but that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what the Ark of the Covenant might look like, and it's kind of this primary piece that's within. Let's go back to Exodus 25. Exodus chapter 25. Let's pick up in verse 10. And they shall make an ark of I never say this word I don't know whether it's, I always say long eye. It's probably not, but that's because I'm on live camera. Of shittim wood, 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and a cubit and a half the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half the height thereof. So by the way, how long's a cubit? Roughly, and that's the general philosophy. I don't know that we'll ever be able to completely know 100% sure, but the general understanding or belief is that a cubit is about 18 inches. So that first part, 2 cubits and a half, so 36 and 9, roughly 45 inches, or what would we probably say? About a little over 4 feet, right? Because we still, I remember when I was in 5th grade, they said that the metric system was coming to America. Guess what? I'm 50 years old and we still don't have it, right? Much simpler system, by the way. Works on nice round, easy numbers like tens. But anyway, the English standard that we're still using inches and feet, and so we would see this box at about a 4 feet 2 cubits, 36, plus a half cubit, 45 inches, almost 2 feet long, or 4 feet rather, long in its size. So not very what? Not very big. It's not very big. Okay, so that's the length, and a cubit and a half, the breadth, so roughly 26, a little over 2 feet. So 4 feet by 2 feet, okay, wide, or 4 feet by 2 feet wide, and a cubit and a half high. 18, half, 9, 27. So again, it's not very big. Okay, 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, basically. I mean, give or take here or there, but it's not a huge structure, or it's not a huge vessel or ark. Thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, and within and without shalt thou overlay it, and shalt make upon it a crown of gold round about. So again, made of wood, overlaid. In gold thou shalt cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in the 4 corners thereof, and 2 rings shall be in the one side of it, and 2 rings in the other side of it. This is food for thought for you. We're talking about detail. We're talking about pattern. We're talking about how specific God was. Now, I would hope, right? If you were given just an assignment, build this box and put 4 rings on it so that you could carry it. You might assume that anyone sensible would put 2 on one side and 2 on the other side. I don't know that any reasonable person would go, you know what, I think I'll just put all 4 of those rings down one side. But God doesn't leave that, right? He's so detailed that He tells them to make these 4 rings, and then He doesn't stop there. He says, and by the way, 2 on this side, 2 on that side. And thou shalt make staves of shittim wood and overlay them with gold, and thou shalt put the staves into the rings by the sides of the ark, that the ark may be borne with them. And so you're never going to carry this ark by what? By your hands, touching it directly. You're going to take these wooden poles. They're going to go through the gold rings that you made, that 2 on each side. You're going to put those wooden staves, and that's going to be how you carry that. When our mind thinks about that, where does it usually go straight to? Uzzah, right? Our minds generally go directly to Uzzah. What was the circumstance there? Okay, and so let's back up half a second, just shortly before that. Why was it on a cart to begin with? Okay.
But he wanted to move it from where it was to closer to Jerusalem.
Okay, who did? David did. And David made the decision to put it on a cart rather than carry it the way God had instructed them to. And in many senses, or in some senses, David becomes culpable for the life. Now, Uzzah receives the punishment because he understood the law too. And as reasonable as it may seem to see this ark about to fall off a cart, for Uzzah's reaction to be to want to stabilize it, he receives the greater punishment for placing his hands upon the ark of the covenant. But that, to us, that's generally the scene that jumps out at us as it relates to this. The ark eventually will what, by the way, in biblical history? It disappears. You see a few references among some of the kings, but eventually you just don't hear about it anymore. It's gone. And therefore all the speculations of movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark come about. And by the way, there have been real, archaeologists and folks like that have pursued trying to find artifacts like the ark that seemingly just disappear from the historical narrative, and no one really knows what happened or what became of them, and so that all that speculative kind of thing. But here's the instructions. This is how you're going to move it. The staves shall be in the rings of the ark; they shall not be taken from it. Thou shalt put into the ark the testimony which I shall give thee. So the ark's going to have to be able to be Right. So we've got to, or at least make it in such a way so we can get this testimony or the law. Thou shalt make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and a cubit and a half the breadth thereof. And thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them in the 2 ends of the mercy seat. And make 1 cherub on the one end and the other cherub on the other end. Again, specific, right? Not 2 on top of each other, not 2, but 1 on each end. And the cherubim shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and their faces shall look one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubims be. And I think when you see this rendering, that's kind of what you see, right? You see these wings over top. You see the faces facing towards one another. You see these wooden staves going through, or these wooden poles going through the staves. So you kind of see this rendering and picture of the ark.
The priests, they were the only ones allowed to carry it, right?
That was the order eventually that will come, instructions that will eventually come as it relates, and you'll see them do that periodically throughout their history. But then notice, so thou shalt put the mercy seat above upon the ark, and in the ark thou shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee, and there I will what? There I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubims which are upon the ark of the testimony of all things which I will give thee in commandment unto the children of Israel. Thou shalt also make a table of shittim wood. 2 cubits shall be the length thereof, and a cubit the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half the height thereof. And thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, and make thereunto a crown of gold round about. And so you see again all of this depiction, all of this specificity of how they're going to construct, what it's going to be purposed for, and really then the beauty of the idea that that's where you're going to come and commune with God. When you have an opportunity to come into the presence of God, He's going to be above the mercy seat. And that's where I'm going to communicate with you and share more of my instructions and commands for you. Now, there's more coming besides just what He got on the mountain. There's more than the 10 commandments. There's more than what comes on the mountain. There's instructions that will continue to come to God's people. And this is the place in which they will come in order to receive that. Thoughts or questions about the ark?
Maybe the mercy seat formed the lid of the ark, perhaps, just by the dimensions of it.
And definitely not a lot more room once you get the cherubims on each end and the wings. You're going to have to be kind of there, right, on the very top of that. You don't really see, in most depictions, what we would think of as a seat as it relates to that, and almost a location by which. I'd have to think about that and look at that, though, Chad, a little more to try to get a visual in my mind of how that mercy seat would be situated, and may very well be just you're talking about the top of the ark.
I think it was interesting. I've read over it a bunch of times. I missed it. I didn't realize that it was gold on the inside as well.
Yeah.
That kind of opened up a can of worms for me.
Yeah. 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 Well, yeah, and you could run that rabbit. You think about that different imagery of the purity that should be within and without, and you think about Jesus called the Pharisees whited sepulchres. That on the outside they look like a real nice, prim and proper place, and on the inside they're full of old men's bones. And so, yeah, you kind of get some of that imagery a little bit as it relates to that.
The way it was made, was it actually a seat that somebody could sit?
Well, that's what Chad was kind of, and I don't think that's the imagery. I don't know that it's called that because that's where God will sit, if you will. That's where God's presence will be found. But I think from the description of the measurements and the depiction, you're talking about the top that it is underneath those wings of the cherubim.
It's like Washington is our seat of government.
Yeah, and I think that it's
His mercy would be.
yeah, and so you've got the purpose is the focus as it relates to that, where they will come in contact with God. Well, that's a good question. I'll throw that out to the class.
The only thing I found was I think it was in Chronicles after the ark was taken out. You're gonna have to help me out. One of the Egyptian, they brought it back or something. And anyway, there's three things that are supposed to be in it, right? The law, the staff, and the manna. When it was brought back, only the Testament was in it. Now, other than that, that's all I know. I don't know why the other two things weren't taken out.
Yeah.
It's in, I think it's in.
And who did? You'd have to look.
Somewhere.
I'd have to think a little while about that specific, because lots of history's flooding my mind, and I'm trying to make sure I sort it all correctly. I could not point you to a specific moment, so I can't validate yes or no to your question, because in my mind I can't tell you where to find it. If they were going, they'd have, and I've thought about that too. You'd have to find a way, but and yet there had to have been a way to get the law in there to begin with too. You know what I mean? Right. I'll have to look, Marlene. I don't want to run a speculative when it comes to that. I want to take a look. I'll try to make a note. Yeah, and again, I can't concrete go to something and say here's where you can read it, and so that's why I'd rather not give you a yay or a nay.
The problem with us, it wasn't just that he touched it; the way they would care it, they were transporting it if they weren't doing it in the right way also.
And that created the situation. Anyway, I'll have to. Yeah, I'll have to. Right. Yeah, and again, and I'm trying to. I guess in some senses I'm trying to stay at the piece of history that I'm in, because things are going to change. I guess that's the best way to say that. There's going to be change. The behaviors as it relates to the ark are going to change. Circumstances are going to come up, and so there are some things that change in the way that they dealt with those things that aren't happening yet. And so eventually, I don't want to necessarily prescribe to this moment in history where they're just first building it and putting it into use to what eventually happens in terms of family members who can carry it, who can't, how those events occurred. I want to be careful not to kind of superimpose those two pieces of history as if they were simultaneous, because we might get a false image, if you will. Any other questions? Okay, so you've got the tabernacle, place to come, make your sacrifices, purify yourself, come to the presence of God. This specific place, this Ark of the Covenant that's going to house the law, it's going to have the mercy seat where God can come and communicate with His people. But then you have to have a what also? In order to guide the people through all these things. You have to have priesthood. And so you establish that priesthood through whom? Aaron. So God chooses Aaron. By the way, the same Aaron that what? Yeah, the same Aaron that told him to go snack, break the gold out of your ears and made that molten calf. So I guess maybe in some senses that could be a twofold thing for us, but maybe the lesson is that God can be what? Forgiving. God can be forgiving and still use somebody who had such a breach and such a failure in his conduct, and yet God still chooses to use him, and not just use him in some simplistic form, but he becomes the figurehead of the priesthood system that is to come after him, despite some of those difficulties and challenges that he experienced. Go to chapter 28, verse 1. So again, these instructions are coming before what? Yeah, and before he comes down off the mountain. So this is chapter 28. Again, remind yourself from a chronological standpoint, the moment Moses comes down and finds the Israelites worshiping an idol is chapter 32. Okay, so these are more instructions and things that God is telling Moses before he comes down off the mountain the first time. And so God's already setting the stage and plan for future events and things that will happen, even knowing what Moses is going to find, because we know that because when finally he's done with Moses on the mountain after those 40 days, he tells Moses, right? What's he tell him? Yeah, you ought to go. Yeah, okay, Mo, time to go, but you're going to be pretty disappointed when you get down here and see what's happening. And so God understood what was going on, but he's still giving these instructions to Moses anyway. Take thou unto thee Aaron thy brother, and his sons with him, from among the children of Israel, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. Even Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, Aaron's sons. The two you, if I asked you who's Aaron's sons, who would you tell me? Nadab and Abihu. I've asked that question in tons of classes. I always get Nadab and Abihu. Rarely have I ever heard anyone say Eleazar or Ithamar, right? You just don't. Why do I, unfortunately, we remember Nadab and Abihu? Because they're the ones that offered strange fire and were consumed of God. And so we tend to remember things that are negative and bad. And so they kind of jump out at us. You'll make for him holy garments, for Aaron, thy brother, for glory and for beauty. And thou shalt speak unto all that are wise-hearted, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. These are the garments which they shall make: a breastplate, and an ephod, and a robe, and a broidered coat, a mitre, and a girdle. And they shall make holy garments for Aaron thy brother and his sons, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. And they shall take gold, and blue, and purple, and scarlet, and fine linen. And they shall make the ephod of gold, of blue, of purple, of scarlet, and fine twined linen, with cunning work. It shall have 2 shoulder pieces thereof, joined at the 2 edges thereof, and so it shall be joined together. And then there's all kinds of further instructions. It's amazing, isn't it? That even the articles of clothing that the priests are going to wear, God doesn't even leave that up to their decision making. God gives them very precise and specific instructions of exactly how they're going to make it. And there would be no doubt who the what were when you see them. Yeah, you may not know Aaron and his sons by their face, right? But you're going to know them when you see them, because they're going to be dressed completely differently than everybody else. There seems to be on the mind of God when he gives these instructions, because he even uses the words earlier in the text when he says, thou shalt make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, for glory and for beauty. These garments are going to represent something very particular and special and important in the scheme that God has. And so he wants it to be distinctive. And it's going to be distinctive in various ways. Thoughts or questions about the garments?
That's the reason God gave the men the wisdom to be able to do all this work.
Yeah.
That you just couldn't do it now, not knowing what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, when you think about it, it is kind of interesting that here's this depiction of such an enormous amount of clothing and paraphernalia, if you will, and yet you have a pretty interesting responsibility in terms of service. Let's look at that for a minute in Numbers chapter 3, because he speaks to that. These also are the generations of Aaron and Moses in the day that the Lord spoke with Moses in Mount Sinai. These are the names of sons of Aaron: Nadab the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of sons of Aaron, the priest, which were anointed, whom he consecrated to minister in the priest's office. And he reminds them, Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered strange fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. They had no children. And Eleazar and Ithamar ministered in the priest's office in the sight of Aaron their father. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Bring the tribe of Levi near, and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may minister unto him. And so we see this transition, if you will. Initially, just Aaron and his sons. Nadab and Abihu die when God consumes them for offering that strange fire. There appears to be there's no children, right? There's no heritage coming along. And so we've got to find another group of folks to add to this list of those who would serve as priests. And now you bring Levi before you, the tribe of Levi before you, and they're going to become now in charge of maintaining the priesthood and the responsibilities. And they shall keep his charge and the charge of the whole congregation before the tabernacle of the congregation to do the service of the tabernacle. They shall keep all the instruments of the tabernacle of the congregation in charge of the children of Israel to do the service of the tabernacle. Thou shalt give the Levites unto Aaron and to his sons. They are wholly given unto him out of the children of Israel. And they shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall wait on their priest's office, and the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death. So you've got this priestly garment distinguishing Aaron and his sons. Ultimately, or eventually, you'll get to the Levites who get added into this equation in terms of serving at the tabernacle and serving Aaron in particular. But I thought it was interesting. Notice verse 10 with me. Thou shalt appoint Aaron and his sons, they shall wait on their priest's office, and the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death. They're protected. They're protected. God gives a shadow of protection over them and some laws and rules that govern how they were allowed and what they were allowed to do as it relates to the priests. And I just found that kind of just an interesting piece of all that description that comes concerning them. So how many sons of Aaron were consecrated as priests? That's a trick question a little bit. All four initially were talked about as making those garments and preparing them for it. But when you saw that, what we just read there in Numbers chapter 3, when there's that consecration that occurs there, there's only two that are left. So depending on how you viewed that, and which two shortly died thereafter, that was kind of the giveaway to the question. Which two died shortly thereafter? That's Nadab and Abihu. So depending on how you viewed that, but really all four of them were initially given the responsibility, and priestly garments were made for them. You saw that early on. Then when the two die, then you have the replacement becomes Levi's heritage that comes along to replace them. And so how were those priestly garments described? There were two words in particular. Okay, glory and beauty is the ones I pointed out, but they're sacred, they're honorable, they serve a very specific purpose. All right, thoughts or questions up to there? I know we're in summary form. We're just kind of working through the history a little bit without dealing with a lot of detail. Okay, so over time, the feasts and special days and holidays they would have would expand tremendously, right? You could, it's going to, over history, it will expand and have various additions, if you will. But there are 3 annual feasts that Scripture talks about that were crucial in the process of unifying the nation and keeping them, if you will, collectively together in their relationship with God. And by the way, that's it's a principle, if you will, that still kind of holds true, right? When nations unify in celebration of something together, there are so many things that keep people at odds with one another. But on occasion, we stumble across something that we can all kind of rally around, if you will, and say, yeah, I can do that. I believe in that. And so it's beneficial to any group or body of people, especially the larger the number it is, to have some things like that, where they can kind of come together and say, yeah, that's something all of us can rally around and support. And so it happens today. There's just a special kind of tone that happens around certain holidays that we have nationally. Well, the same thing for them. They had 3 specific, very important feasts that they were going to honor. Notice Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to be observed in the first month of the Jewish year, which actually translates to our March, April kind of time, as a memorial of the Exodus. And we could, if we had more than 4 minutes, we could go back and look at the details of Leviticus 23 and Exodus 13 and see those specifics. The Feast of Weeks is so named because it comes 7 weeks after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As Leviticus 23 illustrates, this is the 3rd Jewish month, what would translate to our May or June. And because this is the time of the early wheat harvest, the feast is also known as harvest or first fruits. Later becomes known as what? Pentecost. Okay? Remember that 7 week, 49 plus 1 day, 50 days, Penta? That's so that you've got that imagery that eventually comes out and becomes more known by the days separating Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread and it as it relates. And then the third, the Feast of Tabernacles, occurs in the 7th Jewish month, our September or October, and it celebrates the later harvest and commemorates the nomadic existence of the Israelites between their Egyptian bondage and settling in Canaan. So you've got these 3 basic reminders, these 3 basic national holidays, feast days. The first early in their calendar year was Passover, reminding them that God brought them out of Egypt, passed over, if you will, them when the death of the firstborn was occurring to everybody that didn't have the blood over the doorpost. They are spared from that. And so the very first festival of the year for them would be a reminder of the beauty of that benefit of Passover and the unleavened bread that is used at Passover time to commemorate that time period. The second festival then happens 7 weeks after, 49, ultimately that 50 days, Pentecost, this celebration of the first harvest that they would receive. And then the third primary, later on in the 7th month of the Jewish calendar, you see this celebration of the final harvest or the later harvest. And it kind of reminds them of this time period in which they wandered in the wilderness, this kind of moving from location to location as they lived in what? In tabernacles, tents. I understand that there are still some pretty sophisticated ways, by the way, that I've seen folks do this, and you can go Google it if you want to see it. But there are actually still Orthodox Jewish folks who still celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacle, and you will see some pretty clever ways how they stay in tents during that period of time. Somewhat sophisticated. I saw some pretty sophisticated tents as it relates to what you would have seen in their days, but yet there's still those who honor the Feast of Tabernacles and still use a tent in order to kind of commemorate that feast. But those were the 3 main national feast days that would help keep the people unified. And then, again, fast forward in history, many of the good kings, one of the first things they would do when they come back, and they would get into power, if you will, is they would reestablish what? Yeah, the feast days. They'd recognize that the getting away from these feast days among the people was one of the reasons why they got away from God. And so they would reestablish these feast days as a measure by which to try to get the people back in line with Jehovah. Okay, Lord willing, we'll jump into lesson 10. I have lessons 10 and 11 back there for you when you leave tonight if you want to grab them. But we'll jump into lesson 10